My original research in 1990s, when I did my PhD degree in 1996, was related to Alaska, Russian explorations in Alaska, indigenous people of Alaska. And when I was doing my research, I noted at that time that a lot of books, especially at the end of the 1990s, were published from so-called Russian viewpoint. Some authors tried to present historical geography and geographical explorations in the Northern Pacific from a Russian viewpoint. And I started reading deeply this literature, and I understood there was something there. So I realized that glorification and valorization of Russian presence in the Northern Pacific is somehow related to present-day Russian insecurities about their national identity, where they are. So I decided to research it further. So I noted that in public media, on radio, in newspapers, and especially in 2000, 2001, 2003, and closer to our days, we have more of such media that glorifies Russian presence in the Northern Pacific. So to make a long story short, I decided to write an article. And I wrote this article, and I published it in 2008 in an obscure German journal. And I still thought about these people who glorified the Russian presence in the Northern Pacific as a marginal group of people. But for the past 2 years, I realized that these marginal folks now entered mainstream. Okay? That's the reason I decided to excavate my old article, and I prepared a PowerPoint presentation based on this 2008 article. So here we go. As you know, Alaska was a Russian possession until 1867. Here, just screenshots of the most recent articles on internet about Russian presence in Alaska, with this nationalist or patriotic twist, when authors of these publications, they question U.S. presence in Alaska. They promote all kind of mythology that Alaska was not sold to the United States, that Alaska was rented for 99 years, and so forth and so forth. The most popular stereotypes which you may find in Russian media, or when you start talking with semi-educated or sometimes with educated Russian people. So they will tell you about this first 99-year rent. Second thing, some Russians convinced that Catherine the Great sold Alaska to the United States. There's a popular Russian song by rock band Lubé where they sing about this. They curse Catherine for selling Alaska to the United States. And finally, there's a conspiracy theory that the gold paid by the United States at $7+ million were not delivered to Russia, but they were stolen, lost somehow, and didn't reach St. Petersburg. So goals of this paper: to show that Russian-American rhetoric is part of cultural geography of nationalism. And I try to examine in this paper briefly patriotic fictional novels, non-fictional literature in newspapers, on internet, songs, and all kinds of media. Why Alaska? In fact, there is some patriotic and nationalist prose, fiction and non-fiction about Siberia, but not so much. We have to know this. Why Alaska? Here we go, because it's a convenient playground for present-day Russian nationalists. First, unlike other areas of Russia, which Far East Siberia, occasionally glorified as this heroic Russian enterprise, Alaska was sold. So which already for a nationalist a treason. Second, it was sold not to any country, but to the United States. For present-day Russian patriots, it's a den of all kind of evil. It's a nation of shopkeepers. It's a nation that promotes materialism, individualism. So it adds more to their rhetoric, which for the past 3 years resonates well with anti-American sentiments in present-day Russia. And the plus, the last bullet point shows that traditionally for Russian nationalism, the metaphor of North, this fighting against obstacles, that North was somehow polished Russian character, it's also important. So it's Alaska is important for geography of Russian nationalism. As you probably know, that geography of nationalism frequently is wider than the ethnic territory occupied by a particular nation, and other countries also play this nationalistic geography, like Japan prints maps where she colors Sakhalin Island, Kuril Island in a Japanese color. Other Mexican nationalists do the same thing with the southwestern United States. They color Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, and on the maps, occasionally, the Mexican colors. Basically, nationalism, especially when nationalism is insecure, they try to domesticate borderlands. Okay. They claim them. So Russian nationalism not only is not an exception, but even more so, because present-day Russian nationalism still carries this imperial spirit. It didn't get rid of idea of empire. That's the major trouble with Russian nationalism. Two myths nationalist historiography created about Alaska, or so-called Russian America. They talk about bad Western colonizers and Russian progressive colonization. Second thing, it's a spiritual bond. They emphasize spiritual bond. They argue that Alaska was so deeply attached to Russian nation, the Russian empire, that there was a spiritual bond, which is not true. And I will show you that one of my next slides shows this. So this is the one. I put a lot of stuff here, but essentially it describes to you that the Russian presence in Alaska was very thin and weak. It was not formally, yes, on the maps it was colored in the colors of Russian Empire, but in reality a lot of indigenous people who populated Alaska, they were not aware they were part of Russia. Those subjects of the empire who came to live in Alaska, they considered this as a temporary business. There were hardly any people who lived there on permanent basis. I mean Europeans or people who came from Russia. Second thing, when we use the word Russian, we have to put it in quotation marks, because many people who came to explore Alaska, they were not Russians. They came from Finland, they came from Baltic areas, and the major reason is simply because you couldn't freely move out of the mainland Russia. The passport regime, registration, serfdom, crippled colonization, which was one of the major reasons why Russian-American company, the monopoly that controlled Alaska, they couldn't recruit people. They only could go to Finland or work with the Baltic German navigators, who were experienced, of course, navigators. But as far as the Russians are concerned, or other people, Ukrainians, they were serfs. They were hardly any pool of labor from where they could draw the manpower. There were no more than 550 Russians, quote unquote, in Alaska. So with this type of population, we couldn't say that Russia controlled this area. It was a borderland area which was with a thin presence of the empire. Hardships supplying colony. By the way, one of the reasons this expedition was organized, and it might not be a mistake to make the statement that Lysyansk and Krusenstein expedition was to supply Russian America with food and everything. It was a permanent problem for Russian America to be supplied by food. And one of the reasons why they set up so-called Fort Ross in California was because they needed grain, they needed supplies. They had to purchase them from foreign merchants. And one of the, I will give you one example that totally demolishes this present-day rhetoric of Russian nationalists about the presence of tight and organic connection of Alaska to Russia. Hudson Bay Company in 1847 established right in the heart of Russian America trade fort and traded with local Native American tribe, Athabascan tribe, a lucrative trade. And the Russians were not aware about this trading post until 1856. And when they learned about it, they couldn't do anything because they had no manpower resources. So one fact tells us about that there was a very weak presence. Alaska was sold in 1867, as you know, simply because it was very expensive to maintain and supply. Second thing, the fur resources, pelts, sea otter, population was depleted. So Russian-American company was going bankrupt. At the end of their existence, it was specialized not in procurement of sea otters. It was specialized in selling tea because it had nothing to do in this areas. It was going bankrupt. A new Tsar Alexander II, who tried to start liberal reforms, he wanted to get rid of this area, and a few U.S. Congress people were actually bribed in order to make sure that the U.S. government would purchase this piece of land, which Americans called the icebox. And originally they gave a negative response to a Russian suggestion that Alaska be purchased by the United States. And $7 million actually were delivered to St. Petersburg, and they were used to buy trains, locomotives, because railroad industry was booming at that time in Russia. But in Russian patriotic media, these facts are swept under the rug and not mentioned. Okay, they never mentioned that the Russian-American company was going bankrupt. And the sources, I realized the sources of patriotic rhetoric about Alaska being betrayed, being sold to the United States, it's a treason of Alexander II. The sources of this approach are located, should be found at the end of the Second World War, when Russian-Soviet nationalism was on the rise, and we have a bunch of publications. Russian authors published a lot of fictional and non-fictional books about Russian heroes, explorers, fictionalized accounts. And in fact, I don't have audio here, but if we had that audio here, I would have played the Russian Martian Sun. The Sun was written about Russian presence in Alaska, and the words go like this, that our names are known in Alaska along the Yukon River, at the foothills of Rocky Mountains. Everybody knows Russian names, so there was a marching sun. After the Second World War, the view of Russian colonization was totally changed. Before, in 1930s, Russian colonizers was treated as British and French colonizers. But after the Second World War, we have a different view with the rise of Russian-Soviet nationalism. Now, Russian colonialism was presented as some benign force that civilized these areas. Okay, these are the roots of this present-day approach. This benign approach to Russian colonization. Russians, when the West, they said, and Russian patriots, quote unquote, say that West colonized borderlands, whereas Russia domesticated them. And the first book that laid the grounds for what today Russian patriots how Russian patriots today imagine Alaska. The roots are here. It's a book by Sergei Markov, a Russian poet and writer. 1 million copies, Russians in Alaska, published by Military Publishing House in 1946. It's a very characteristics in the series, library of Navy officer, a special series of the books. So it was related to the ongoing Cold War at that time. And the second book about the first chair of the Russian-American company, Baranov Island. Baranov was the name of the person who was in charge of Russian-American company, the fictionalized account. See, the print runs of these publications were very high circulation. Major characters in present-day patriotic fictional literature, empire builders, evil, unscrupulous Englishmen and Americans, and shaky Poles, treasonous Poles, a lot of characters, Polish characters who are backstabbing, and the Germans. The Germans are interesting characters. After the Second World War, in these books I mentioned, Germans were pictured as evil because the memory of the Second World War. But today, people like Rosenberg are pictured in the nationalistic spirit as a good empire builders, as Russian patriots. It's because a lot of patriotic writers, they argue that Germans, like Russian nationalists, they know the value of organic blood and soil, so they in one of the recent books by writer Bushkov, Alaska, Glory and Shame, he actually divides this good and bad foreigners. For instance, Rosenberg was a good foreigner at the service of Russian Empire, Russian patriot. Bad foreigners, it's English and American explorers. So let me, since our first paper giver told us about Rosenberg, let me kind of make a follow-up in this case. Adam Johann von Rosenberg, in fictional book Baranov Island, published by Ivan Krat, 1946, he was pictured as a bad German. Adam Johann von Rosenberg, who was called evil. He goes to England. He learns from the nation of shopkeepers, and he is not concerned about interests of the Russian Empire. If you go to this book, Bushkov, Russian America, Glory and Shame, here he's not Adam Johann anymore. He's Ivan Fyodorovich Rosenberg. He's a good Russian patriot who takes close the interests of the empire, who tries to fight against evil English people, Americans, so he defends the empire. One of the most recent popular metaphors in the patriotic literature, it's a metaphor about Alexander II as a treasonous czar who sold Alaska to the United States. And here the link is drawn between 1990s, when the market reforms in Russia and liberal reforms of Alexander II. So Alaska became this the land that was sacrificed at the altar of market reforms. This person, particular Ivan Mironov, Russian nationalist historian, he argues that, in fact, it was not Americans who were bribed. It was the court of the Russian Tsar, which wasn't true, that was bribed to sell Alaska to the United States. And the most exotic conspiracy theory is this book, Alaska Discovered and Sold, by this guy, a certain Kremlov. He argues that Freemasons were responsible for this, for the sale of Alaska. They conspired that in the court of Russian Tsar, Freemasons. He also argues that Jewish interests promoted the sale of Alaska to the United States. And in fact, he uses one of the former general governors of Alaska before Alaska was sold to the United States was Nikola Rosenberg. And he said, look at his name, Nikola Rosenberg. He was a Jew. Jews plotted to conspire to sell Alaska to the United States. Little did he know that Rosenberg, it's a old Baltic German lineage. And in fact, Alfred Rosenberg, one of the chief ideologists of National Socialist regime, belonged to this lineage, Rosenberg. So it has nothing to do with Jews. It's a very exotic conspiracy theory we have to deal with. So my time is running out, so let me make some conclusions. Russian Alaska reading list today. If you go to like a bus station, if you go to a railroad depot, like airport, you will see a bunch of these books at the newspaper kiosk. They are bestsellers, they are well read, which feeds educated and semi-educated Russians the history of Alaska written from a Russian viewpoint. Those historians who study the history of Alaska, who try to excavate archival documents, present them, they are not listened to. They are blamed in being successors of these treasonous people who sold Alaska to the United States. And basically we deal, whatever we see on the internet, a lot of publications on Alaska history that comes from patriotic writers, we deal with imagination, and people don't want to accept facts because they are not convenient facts. And that's what's natural for any nationalism. So we do not need facts, we need this mythology that somehow was spread around, beginning from the Cold War, because if we look at the time when Alaska had been sold to the United States, 1860s, 1870s, nobody was interested in this. Hardly anybody heard about it. So the interest was on the rise since the beginning of the 1940s, 1950s. So present-day patriotic writers, they inherited this Cold War baggage. That's what we have to deal with. Thank you so much.